I had barely lowered a single rose onto my son's casket when my daughter-in-law leaned in close and said words that cut deeper than grief itself. "Stop the drama, pack up and survive." Her voice was flat, cold, and final. There was no trace of compassion, no space for mourning. Just hours earlier I had been standing beside her in black, both of us watching the earth take my only child. Now she was handing me an eviction notice disguised as advice. By the time the sun dropped below the Denver skyline, I was sitting behind the wheel of my aging Honda Civic, with everything I owned stuffed into boxes and trash bags. My hands were numb from the February cold and from the shock of how quickly a home could become a memory. I parked under the flickering light of a Walmart lot, sipping bitter coffee bought with coins I scraped from the bottom of the glove box. In the silence between the hum of the engine and the gusts of winter air, I replayed the years I had given to my son, the sacrifices I had made, the pride I felt in watching him succeed. And now here I was counting coins just to keep warm. I thought the worst had already happened when I buried him. I was wrong. The worst was still unfolding. Then the phone rang. The voice on the other end carried something I had not felt in days: possibility. My son, it seemed, had known this day might come, and he had left something behind that could change everything. I remember every detail of that afternoon as if it had been carved into my mind with a dull blade. The funeral had ended less than an hour earlier. My hands still smelled faintly of the roses I had placed on my son's casket. The air outside was cold and damp, the kind of February chill that sinks into your bones. I drove back to the house in a haze, expecting silence, maybe even a quiet moment to sit alone and try to process the day. Instead, I turned into the driveway and saw a sight that stopped me cold. My belongings were stacked on the curb in uneven towers, cardboard boxes sealed with tape, some bulging at the sides as if they had been packed in haste. A few items were loose: an old photo frame, a folded blanket, my winter boots, spilled onto the concrete as though they were nothing more than trash. Lorraine was standing at the front door, a new set of keys swinging from her hand. Her black funeral dress had been replaced by jeans and a sweater, and she wore the kind of expression people reserve for business transactions, not family. She did not greet me, did not offer an explanation. She simply pointed to the boxes. "You will not be coming back inside," she said. "The locks have been changed." At first I thought she was in shock, or maybe saying something she did not fully mean. We had just buried Kieran. Surely this was grief speaking. But her eyes were steady and hard. She had been waiting for this moment, rehearsing it. That much was clear. I asked her why, my voice shaking with a mixture of disbelief and anger. Her answer was simple: "The house belongs to me now." That was all she said before turning back inside. I stood there in the driveway, my breath rising in visible clouds, my hands frozen at my sides. A neighbor across the street was raking leaves in his yard, pausing now and then to glance in my direction. Another stood at her kitchen window, not even pretending not to stare. The weight of their silent judgment pressed on me. They saw an old man being pushed out of his home, and they probably assumed there was more to the story, that I had done something to deserve it. I did not fight her, not then. Part of me knew I was too drained, too unprepared for a confrontation I could not win in that moment. I loaded what I could into my Honda Civic, cramming boxes into the back seat and trunk. My father's old tools clanked together with every movement. The rest of my things I left on the curb, too large or awkward to fit. She watched me from the doorway, arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line. She did not speak again until I closed the car door. "Do not come back here," she said. "If you do, I will call the police." By the time I pulled out of the driveway, the sun had dipped behind the rooftops and the cold had deepened. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel. I drove aimlessly for a while, not ready to face the reality of my situation. Eventually, I found myself in the parking lot of a Walmart on East Evans. The lot was half full, lit by tall lamps that flickered every so often. I parked near the back, away from the store entrance, but close enough to see other cars. I reclined the seat as far as it would go, which was not far, and tried to rest. Sleep did not come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her at the door with those keys in her hand. Every sound in the parking lot, a shopping cart rattling against the pavement, a car engine starting, made my heart race. I kept telling myself this was temporary, that I just needed a day or two to figure things out, but deep down I knew this was more than a bad night. She had acted with speed and precision, changing the locks before the hearse even reached the cemetery. This was not an impulsive decision. She had planned it. That thought stayed with me through the night. It was the first crack in the picture I had of my son's marriage, the first sign that something deeper and more dangerous was at play. I did not know how far it went, but I promised myself one thing before dawn broke over the Walmart sign. I would not disappear quietly. I would survive long enough to find out exactly why she had struck so fast and what she thought she had taken from me. The second night hit harder than the first because the shock had begun to fade and the mechanics of survival had taken its place. Cold was no longer an inconvenience. It was a living thing that settled into my joints and made a home there. The heater in my Honda Civic barely worked, and I learned quickly that running it non-stop would drain the gas faster than I could afford, so I rationed it, 15 minutes every hour. Just enough to take the edge off before the temperature sank again. I timed it by the dashboard clock, counting the slow crawl of the minute hand while my breath fogged the inside of the windshield. Food was another calculation. I had less than $200 in cash and no idea when I would have a stable address again. I stopped at McDonald's and ordered from the dollar menu, stretching each sandwich into 2 sittings. The hot coffee helped, but only for as long as it stayed warm in my hands. I could feel the employees' eyes on me when I lingered too long, so I moved on before they could ask me to leave. Mornings became a series of small humiliations I had to endure if I wanted to keep going. I brushed my teeth in a gas station restroom, keeping my eyes low to avoid the mirror. Washed my face in a sink barely wider than my hands. My clothes smelled faintly of the car, that mix of old fabric, dust, and the faint sourness of stress. A part of me wanted to disappear completely, to let the cold finish what it had started, but something else kept pushing me forward. It was during one of those mornings that I started to think less about comfort and more about strategy. I sat in a booth at a diner, nursing a refillable coffee, and pulled a napkin toward me. On it I began sketching a plan, not for shelter, not for food, but for answers. If Lorraine had been able to force me out so quickly, there had to be a legal trail behind her actions. Paperwork, filings, something that would explain how she gained control so fast. I listed out the possibilities: Kieran's will, probate filings, property deeds, business ownership records. Anything that might reveal a crack in the foundation she was standing on. The thought steadied me. This wasn't just about finding a bed for the night. This was about reclaiming what I had lost, or at least understanding how it had been taken. That night, the Walmart lot felt less like a prison and more like a base of operations. I still watched for security guards, noting how long they lingered near my car before moving on. I learned which lights in the lot stayed on without flickering and which cameras rotated just enough to give me a blind spot. Every small observation felt like information I could use. By the time I lay back in the driver's seat, wrapped in the thin blanket I had managed to grab before leaving the house, the napkin with my plan was tucked safely into the glove box. My body ached from the cold, my stomach grumbled from the half meals, and my pride was bruised raw. But for the first time since that day at the cemetery, I had something to work toward. I was no longer just enduring, I was calculating. By the third day, I realized that sitting in parking lots and rationing heat would only keep me alive, not move me forward. Survival was one thing, but answers were another. I needed a place where the cold couldn't reach me, where my mind could work without my body shivering itself into exhaustion. That is how I ended up at the Denver Public Library. The library was warm in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. The hum of quiet conversation, the faint scent of paper and ink, the steady rhythm of keyboards clicking, it all worked like a salve on nerves that had been raw since the funeral. I chose a corner table near the wall, one with an outlet for my old phone charger, and spread out my few belongings, a notepad, a pen, and the napkin with my scrawled plan. This wasn't just a stop to rest. This was going to be my headquarters. I started with the obvious. Probate filings are public record, and the library's computer terminals gave me free access to the county's database. My fingers hesitated over the keyboard before typing in my son's full name. The results came back faster than I expected. His estate had already gone through the first stages of probate, remarkably fast considering he had been gone less than a week. There it was in black and white, Lorraine's name listed as the sole beneficiary. Soul, no mention of me, not as a secondary, not as a trustee, nothing. It didn't match the man I knew. Kieran was methodical, deliberate. He never left things to chance. This was the son who once spent 3 weeks researching insurance policies before buying a single one. The same son who insisted on showing me the breakdown of his retirement portfolio just to make sure I understood how he was planning for the future. To imagine him leaving me with nothing, not even the roof over my head, did not sit right. That feeling only deepened when I noticed the name of the attorney who had filed the probate paperwork. I recognized it immediately, but not from Kieran's past dealings. This was not the lawyer I had seen at his business dinners, the one he spoke of with trust and respect. It was someone else entirely. A different firm, a different specialty. That alone made my instincts flare. Why change attorneys for something as important as a will? I wrote both names down side by side. One was the probate attorney. The other, the one I remembered, had handled Kieran's corporate work and personal legal matters for years. If there were 2 lawyers involved, there might be 2 sets of documents. And if there were 2 sets of documents, one of them might contain the truth. The rest of the afternoon became a blur of searches. Property deeds, business licenses, articles of incorporation, anything that might show where Lorraine's authority began and where it might end. Each piece of information went into my notepad, written carefully so I could trace the connections later. By closing time, I had the beginnings of a map, not a clear one yet, but enough to see that Lorraine's control might not be as airtight as she thought. I packed my things slowly, feeling a small spark of energy in my chest. The library had given me more than warmth. It had given me a direction. That night in the Walmart lot, the cold felt the same, but I felt different. The image of her standing at the doorway with those keys still burned in my mind, but now it was layered with something new, a quiet conviction that I had just taken my first real step toward unraveling her plan. The name of the second attorney kept circling in my mind like a loose thread that begged to be pulled. I could see him clearly in my memory, tall, silver-haired, the kind of man who carried himself like every detail mattered. I had met him at one of Kieran's business dinners years ago. He was warm but professional, the type who remembered not only your name but the way you took your coffee. Over the years, Kieran had spoken of him with respect, saying he was the one who handled important matters that couldn't afford mistakes. The probate attorney, on the other hand, was a stranger. I had never heard Kieran mention him. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Why would my son, meticulous about both his business and personal life, abandon the lawyer he trusted most when writing his will, especially so recently before his death? I decided to stop wondering and start asking. The next morning, I walked back to the library, claimed my usual corner table, and found the number for the older attorney's office, Howard Brent, Family Law and Estate Planning. I hesitated for a long moment before dialing. My life had been stripped to such bare essentials that even making a call like this felt risky, as though asking questions might provoke the wrong people. When the receptionist answered, I gave my name and explained that I was Kieran Kellogg's father. The line went silent for a moment, long enough that I thought we'd been disconnected. Then she spoke again, her tone completely different, lower, more deliberate. "Mr. Kellogg, can you hold for just a moment?" I said yes, though my heart had already begun to pound. The hold music lasted barely 30 seconds before she returned. "Mr. Brent would like to speak with you directly. Can you come in today?" That word, urgent, wasn't said aloud, but it was there in her voice, as clear as if she had shouted it. Nobody cleared their schedule for a man living out of his car unless there was a reason. I told her I could be there, though I had no real transportation plan beyond my aging Civic and a vague sense of the address. After hanging up, I sat back in the stiff library chair, staring at the phone in my hand. That one brief exchange confirmed what I had begun to suspect. I wasn't crazy. There was more to Kieran's estate than Lorraine knew or than she wanted me to know. 2 lawyers meant 2 sets of priorities. Somewhere in the spaces between their work, there might be a truth worth uncovering. Before leaving the library, I went back into the public records system and printed every document I could find that tied Kieran to Howard Brent's office. Contracts, incorporation papers for his company, a living trust document from 3 years ago that bore Howard's signature and Kieran's own. That trust didn't appear in the probate filings. It was as if it had been erased from the official picture. I folded the papers carefully, slid them into a manila envelope, and tucked it into my bag. This was the first real proof I had that Lorraine's victory might not be permanent. As I stepped out into the cold afternoon air, the wind sharp against my face, I felt the weight of the envelope like a heartbeat against my side. That night in the car, I didn't stare at the ceiling wondering how I had ended up here. Instead, I replayed the sound of the receptionist's voice, the subtle urgency that told me I was finally moving towards something. I didn't know exactly what Howard would say when we met, but I knew one thing for certain. My son had trusted this man for a reason. And that reason might be the key to taking my life back. I was on my way out of the library the next morning, clutching the manila envelope of printed records, when I heard someone call my name. I turned and saw a man in his late 40s, dressed in a dark overcoat, snow clinging to the shoulders. It took me a second to recognize him without the suit and tie, but then his face clicked into place. Silas Drake, my son's business partner. I had only met Silas a few times over the years, but I remembered the easy way he and Kieran spoke to each other, the shorthand of men who had built something side by side. Now he was standing in the library's lobby, expression caught between sympathy and urgency. "I've been trying to find you," he said, stepping closer. "A friend mentioned you might be here. I heard about what happened." His voice dropped lower. "It's terrible, Norman. Kieran would be furious." Hearing my son's name spoken with such conviction did something to me. For days I had been adrift, defined only by loss and displacement. Here was someone who still connected me to the man I had raised, not just as a father, but as a part of his life's work. We stepped outside, our breath curling in the cold. Silas asked where I was staying. I told him the truth, in my car, moving from one parking lot to another. His jaw tightened. Without another word, he pulled out his phone, tapped a few times, and then looked up at me. "There's a Goodwill on East Colfax. You'll take the number 15 bus. Here." He slid a card into my hand, $40 loaded. "Use it to buy yourself something decent to wear. Dress like the man you are, Norman. You've got a meeting with Howard Brent coming, right?" I nodded slowly, still processing the gesture. It wasn't just the money, it was the way he said it, like my dignity was a fact that had been misplaced, not lost forever. The Goodwill store was warm and smelled faintly of detergent and dust. Racks of clothes lined the aisles, each piece holding some stranger's history. I ran my hands along the jackets and coats, feeling the textures, weighing the condition. Then I saw it, a navy suit hanging between a bulky parka and a worn sport coat. The fabric was soft but structured, the stitching intact, the kind of garment someone had once taken pride in wearing. In the dressing room, I slipped it on. The mirror reflected a version of myself I hadn't seen in weeks. The lines in my face were still there, but the slump in my shoulders eased. The suit fit better than I expected, and it carried weight, not just the fabric, but the memory of standing tall, of being seen as a man with purpose. I paid $14 at the register, folded the suit carefully into a plastic bag, and stepped back into the cold with change in my pocket and something unfamiliar in my chest: anticipation. The bus ride back toward the library was quiet, but in my mind I was rehearsing the meeting with Howard, what I would say, how I would present myself. By the time I returned to the Civic, I realized Silas had given me more than a bus card and $40. He had given me a reminder I badly needed, that dignity could be a weapon. It didn't just change how others saw me, it changed how I saw myself. And if I was going to face Lorraine and whatever game she was playing, I needed every weapon I could get. Howard Brent's office was nothing like I expected. I had imagined something sterile and overly polished, the kind of place where people talked in rehearsed tones and watched the clock while you spoke. Instead, it felt lived in but deliberate. Dark wood shelves lined the walls, filled with legal volumes and framed photographs. There was the faint scent of coffee and leather, the quiet hum of a heater running somewhere out of sight. Howard himself rose from behind a wide desk as soon as I stepped in. He looked much the same as I remembered: silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses, the same steady gaze I'd seen years ago at Kieran's business dinner. But there was something else in his expression now. Something that told me this meeting was not routine. "Norman," he said, coming around the desk to shake my hand, "you've been through hell. Sit down, we have important things to discuss." I sat across from him, my Goodwill suit doing its job of making me feel like I belonged in this chair. He listened without interrupting as I told him everything: Lorraine's eviction on the day of the funeral, the nights in the car, the scraps of information I'd gathered at the library. His jaw tightened slightly at certain points, but he never cut in. When I finished, he nodded once and stood. "Your son was a very forward-thinking man," Howard said. He walked to the far corner of the room where a heavy safe stood against the wall. He turned the dial slowly, the clicks of the combination lock loud in the quiet office. When the door swung open, he reached inside and pulled out a large sealed envelope. It had my name on the front, written in Kieran's precise, deliberate handwriting. For a moment, my breath caught. Seeing his writing, those familiar loops and angles, was like hearing his voice. Howard carried the envelope back to the table and set it in front of me with a kind of reverence. "Kieran anticipated that there might be complications," Howard said carefully. "He left specific instructions in the event that certain people acted against your interests." I broke the seal, my hands unsteady. Inside was a letter and several official-looking documents. The letter came first. In it, Kieran explained that he had foreseen the possibility of betrayal and had taken steps to protect me. He described a financial structure, a firewall he called it, that placed a significant portion of his assets beyond Lorraine's reach. The accounts, worth far more than I could have imagined, were tied to biometric access, my fingerprint, my retinal scan. Without me, they were nothing more than locked doors with no keys. Then came the second revelation. Attached to the letter was a folder containing evidence, dates, notes, and even copies of communications that suggested Lorraine's intentions long before Kieran's death. Meetings with divorce attorneys, inquiries about nursing homes, quiet efforts to remove me from Kieran's life and his home. It wasn't rumor or suspicion, it was documented fact. I sat there for a long time, the weight of it pressing into me. The man I had raised hadn't just thought of me with love, he had protected me with precision. This was not an impulsive act born of fear. It was a calculated plan, the kind of meticulous preparation that came from knowing exactly what kind of person you were dealing with. Howard watched me take it all in. "Your son left you more than money," he said. "He left you the means to defend yourself. You're not powerless, Norman. You've been holding more cards than she realizes." And for the first time in weeks, I felt something shift inside me. Love, I understood now, could be as meticulous as any legal strategy, and Kieran's love had just handed me the tools to fight back. The widow's name was Edith, and she was the kind of person who seemed to understand what you needed before you said a word. Howard had arranged it, an extra room in her guest house near Cherry Creek, rent-free until I could get back on my feet. She greeted me at the door with a warm handshake, a pot of coffee already brewing, and a quiet assurance that I was welcome for as long as I needed. For the first time in weeks, I slept in a real bed. No shivering in the driver's seat, no flickering parking lot lights keeping me half awake, no cold seeping into my bones. I woke the next morning with a clear head and the sharp, almost painful awareness of how much I had been operating in survival mode. The bed, the heat, the simple security of locking a door behind me, it all stripped away the fog and left me face to face with a simple truth. This wasn't about getting back what I had lost. It was about taking back my name. The days that followed became a disciplined routine. Edith's guest house had a small desk by the window, and that became my command center. I laid out every document Howard had given me, Kieran's letter, the account details, the evidence folder. I opened a notebook and started cataloging everything: dates, amounts, receipts, emails, every figure that could be tied to Kieran's business and personal accounts. I wrote down and repeated to myself until I could recall them without looking. If anyone challenged me in a meeting or a courtroom, I wanted to speak with the confidence of a man who knew his ground down to the penny. In the evenings, I practiced my testimony out loud. I imagined myself in front of a judge, in front of Lorraine, in front of anyone who might try to twist the truth. I kept my voice steady, my statements clear, my tone controlled. Edith sometimes played devil's advocate, tossing questions at me that caught me off guard, forcing me to think on my feet. She was sharper than most people half her age, and I knew she was doing me a favor. I also made trips into the city, using Howard's guidance to visit public records offices, the bank, and a few contacts of Kieran's who might be willing to speak. Every meeting was a chance to quietly gather more pieces of the puzzle, to solidify my position before anyone realized how much ground I was gaining. When I wasn't rehearsing or researching, I studied the evidence Kieran had left. I read through the transcripts of Lorraine's meetings with lawyers, the timelines she had drawn up for her own advantage. The level of calculation was astonishing, but so was the foresight Kieran had shown in documenting it all. Piece by piece, I was building not just a case, but a story in which I was no longer the man sleeping in his car, but the man who had been wronged and was ready to prove it. By the end of that first week in Edith's guest house, the transformation was undeniable. My suit hung pressed and ready in the closet. My notes were organized in labeled folders. I could recite key figures without hesitation. And most importantly, I no longer felt like I was reacting to Lorraine's moves. I was preparing my own. This wasn't about draining her accounts or humiliating her in public, though the thought of her seeing me standing tall again had its own satisfaction. It was about restoring the balance she had shattered, about making sure that when people spoke my name, it wasn't with pity or doubt. The man who had been thrown out into the cold had been stripped of his dignity. The man who now sat at Edith's desk, pen in hand and strategy on paper, was ready to take it back. It started with a knock at Edith's guesthouse door early one morning. A courier stood outside, a thick envelope in his hand and an apologetic look on his face. "Are you Mr. Kellogg?" he asked. I nodded, and he handed me the envelope before walking briskly back to his van. Inside, the documents were crisp, official, and dripping with insult. Lorraine, through her attorney Clement Stern, had filed a petition for guardianship over me. Guardianship, an accusation wrapped in legal language that claimed I was incapable of managing my own affairs. It was the kind of maneuver designed to strip a person of their rights without ever setting foot in a criminal court. According to the petition, my recent homelessness and erratic living conditions proved I was unfit to handle financial matters. The irony was sharp enough to taste. The same woman who had thrown me into the street was now using the consequences of that act as evidence of my incompetence. Howard reviewed the papers at his office that afternoon. He didn't even bother hiding his smirk. "Desperate move," he said, flipping through the pages. "These petitions are hard to win without medical proof. And they've got nothing but circumstance." He looked up at me. "We'll counter with a psychological evaluation from a reputable doctor. Once you pass that, this filing will look like exactly what it is, an intimidation tactic." The second wave came 2 days later, this time in the form of a phone call. Lorraine's voice was smooth, almost pleasant, as if the past weeks hadn't happened. She suggested we meet to discuss a settlement. I agreed to the meeting. Not because I intended to settle, but because I wanted to see her eyes when she realized I wasn't desperate anymore. We met in a small coffee shop downtown. She was already seated, a designer handbag at her side, her nails freshly manicured. After a few meaningless pleasantries, she slid a check across the table, $200,000. "All you have to do is agree not to pursue any legal challenges," she said. "You can walk away from all this with dignity." I stared at the check for a moment, then looked back at her. "You want to buy me off," I said. She smiled faintly. "I want to avoid unnecessary unpleasantness." The number on that check might have been staggering to me once, but now, knowing the scale of what Kieran had secured for me, it felt small, pitiful even. That money had been mine in one form or another from the beginning. It was my son's work, built in part on my early sacrifices, and here she was, offering a fraction of it as though she were doing me a kindness. I slid the check back across the table. "Keep it," I said. "You're going to need every penny for what's coming." Her smile faltered for the first time. "What's coming?" she asked, her voice sharp now. I stood, putting on my coat. "Justice," I said simply, and left her sitting there, the check untouched between us. Each move she made, filing for guardianship, hinting at my incompetency, trying to buy my silence, only strengthened my position. Howard said it best: "Power is loud when it panics." Lorraine was starting to realize that she had underestimated me, and every attempt to push me back was proof that she knew the ground beneath her was shifting. Howard's conference room was all polished wood, tall windows, and the quiet hum of authority. The long table gleamed under the overhead lights, and on it sat a single neat stack of documents, Kieran's will, ready to be read aloud. Lorraine arrived with Clement at her side, her black suit tailored to perfection, her confidence radiating like heat. I sat across from her. My Goodwill suit replaced by something sharper, cleaner, bought with a fraction of the funds my son had left me. Howard began with the formalities. He read through the primary provisions of the will in an even, measured tone. The house, the furnishings, the business, all left to Lorraine. A monthly stipend for me, $800. I caught the flicker of a smile on her face when she glanced my way, a smile that said she believed this was the end of the matter. To her. It must have felt like watching a door lock from the inside. When Howard finished, Clement closed his legal pad and began gathering his things. "That concludes the reading," he said with a kind of finality that suggested he had other appointments more worthy of his time. But Howard didn't move. "There is one additional matter," he said. He rose, crossed the room to his safe, and returned with a sealed envelope. My name was written on it in Kieran's careful handwriting. "This," Howard said, "is a private bequest, separate from the probate proceedings." Lorraine's eyes narrowed. "I have a right to see that," she said. "No," Howard replied without looking at her. "Under Colorado law, personal bequests may remain confidential if they do not alter the primary estate. This is between father and son." I opened the envelope slowly, deliberately, letting the weight of the moment settle over the room. Inside were three things: a letter from Kieran, a set of documents detailing offshore accounts and legal trusts in my name, and a folder of printed emails and time-stamped photographs. I set the letter aside for later. The rest I placed gently on the table, sliding them toward Lorraine so she could see the headings without touching them. Swiss account details, Cayman trust agreements, photographs of her meeting with divorce attorneys, emails in which she referred to me as the old burden and discussed disposing of me after the funeral. Each page was dated, each timestamp clear. I didn't speak at first. I watched her eyes move across the words, watched the color drain from her face. Clement leaned in to read over her shoulder, his confident posture collapsing as he realized what he was looking at. "This is illegal," Lorraine said finally, her voice brittle. "No," I said, my voice calm. "This is preparation. My son knew exactly who you were, and he made sure I would be protected. The accounts are legally mine. The evidence is legally gathered. And you have just been handed proof that your plans for me were never about grief. They were about greed." The silence after that was thick, the kind that swallows every other sound in the room. Lorraine looked at Clement, but he had no ready words. Howard leaned back in his chair, hands folded, letting the moment speak for itself. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I had placed the truth between us, and in that silence the arithmetic worked itself out. She had the house, the furniture, and the business, everything she thought mattered. I had my freedom, my resources, and a clear path to dismantle whatever power she believed she still had. In the weeks after the reading, I did not have to lift a finger to dismantle what remained of Lorraine's stability. The evidence I held was not a weapon I needed to swing wildly. It was a shadow that followed her everywhere she went. Clients of Kieran's business grew wary once whispers began circulating about her treatment of me. Business associates she had counted on to support her quietly withdrew, their loyalty dissolving when faced with the truth. Even Clement, her attorney, began to scale back his involvement, perhaps sensing his own reputation was in jeopardy. I did not seek to destroy her. That was never my goal. I simply refused to protect her anymore. I let the truth breathe, let her past decisions stand under their own weight, without the protection of my silence. Her own actions began to close in on her. Financial pressures mounted as deals fell through. The mortgage on the Cherry Creek house, once a point of pride, became a chokehold. The market softened and she was forced to list it well below its value. I read the listing online one morning while sipping coffee in Edith's kitchen. It felt strange to see the photographs of rooms I once lived in, now staged to look inviting for strangers. The guardianship petition was quietly withdrawn after my psychological evaluation came back flawless. The hush money offer was never mentioned again. She no longer called, no longer sent letters through attorneys. Whatever plan she had built for herself had unraveled, not because I pushed, but because it had been woven with greed and contempt from the start. One chilly morning in late April, I left the courthouse after finalizing some unrelated paperwork with Howard. The wind carried a faint scent of rain, and the sidewalk was crowded with people rushing to beat the weather. I was adjusting my coat collar when I heard my name. Lorraine stood a few feet away, her once polished appearance dimmed. The expensive suits and designer accessories were gone, replaced by a plain jacket and scuffed shoes. Her voice was low, almost uncertain. "Norman, I need help, just something temporary, until I can get back on my feet. For a moment." I thought about the first night in the Walmart parking lot, the way my breath had fogged the cold air as I counted coins for coffee. I thought about her standing in the doorway of the house, telling me to pack my bags while my son's grave was still fresh. I met her gaze and spoke without anger, without triumph. "Learn to survive," I said. The same words she had given me, returned without venom, but with the weight of everything that had happened. Her expression faltered. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. I stepped past her, merging into the stream of people moving down the sidewalk. The life ahead of me was not the one I had expected before Kieran's death, but it was one he had secured for me with care and foresight. It was a life built on the truth, not on fear or dependence. I did not look back. There was nothing for me in that past anymore. The road forward was mine, and this time I would walk it with my head high. The grass around Kieran's grave had grown in thick since the cold days of his funeral, the soil no longer raw but settled, as if the earth itself had taken a deep breath. I knelt down and set a small bouquet of fresh lilies against the stone. The air was cool, touched with the scent of spring rain, and the cemetery was quiet except for the rustle of leaves overhead. I rested my hand on the smooth granite, tracing his name with my fingertips. I thought justice would feel like winning. I said softly, "But it's not about winning, not really. It's about standing up again after someone tried to bury you. It's the weight back in my spine, the dignity you made sure I could reclaim." For a while I stayed there, letting the silence between us speak more than words could. Then I stood, brushing the damp from my knees, and walked back to the car. The drive home wound through streets lined with budding trees, each turn bringing me closer to a house that was mine in every sense, paid for with foresight and protected by the bond between father and son. When I pulled into the driveway, the porch light glowed warmly against the evening. I stepped inside to rooms that were not just shelter, but proof that I had not disappeared, that I had chosen to live on my own terms. 2 signatures had built this life, his faith in me, and my refusal to let anyone erase who I am.